Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Okay.
Today, we are opening up a really fascinating stack of sources, all focused on just one single seismic year, 1917.
It really was. This wasn't just another year in history. It was a moment where the world seemed to be collapsing and, being radically rebuilt at the exact same time.
All under the immense pressure of the Great War.
Yeah.
So our mission today is to really get you up to speed on this pivotal year. We're going to unpack this convergence of three huge shifts.
Right. First, you have America finally abandoning neutrality and jumping into the war. Then there's the complete messy collapse of Imperial Russia into revolution.
And crucially, the third piece, which we'll connect everything to, is this severe internal battle for democracy and basic rights that just exploded on the American home front as a direct result of that global war.
Exactly. We'll connect those external battlefield decisions to these potent new tools of state control at home. You'll see everything from secret telegrams that literally promised Mexico the American Southwest
Wow.
to, the shocking documented torture used against American women activists.
Okay, let's dive in and start with that big international shift. America had clung so fiercely to neutrality, but that all ended on April 6, 1917. President Wilson signs the declaration of war. So what were the final catalysts? What finally broke that policy?
Well, there were two huge provocations in early 1917 that just made staying neutral impossible. The first one was purely military and economic.
Okay.
Germany announced it was resuming unrestricted submarine warfare on February 1st. Their goal was simple: sink any ship, neutral or not, that was approaching European ports.
Trying to starve Britain out before the U.S. could mobilize.
Precisely. Wilson even called it a war against all mankind. But the second provocation, that's the one that really lit the fuse with the American public.
The Zimmermann telegram.
The Zimmermann telegram. It's just an astonishing piece of secret diplomacy. It was a German communication intercepted in January, proposing a full military alliance with Mexico.
And what was Germany offering?
They offered Mexico massive financial support, and this is the incredible part, the return of territories they had lost: Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona.
I mean, the sheer nerve of it
Yeah.
it's staggering. To actively try and fund a war to redraw the map of the American Southwest.
And when it was published, the American public was enraged. Any doubts about its authenticity just vanished on March 3rd when the German official, Arthur Zimmermann himself, publicly admitted it was real.
So that was the tipping point.
It had to be. It proved Germany wasn't just fighting a war in Europe. They were actively plotting against the U.S. on its own continent. And that's when Wilson elevates the whole thing into this moral crusade, famously saying the goal was to make the world safe for democracy.
But that grand vision, of course, required a massive, unprecedented mobilization at home.
Right, which meant two things immediately: troops and money.
Let's start with the troops.
Well, to raise an army that quickly, Congress passed the Selective Service Act on May 18th. This authorized compulsory enlistment, the draft.
And then the money. That's a staggering financial challenge. They couldn't just print currency, right? I mean, the Civil War showed that just leads to runaway inflation.
Exactly. The Treasury Secretary, William McAdoo, was determined to avoid that. So he came up with the Liberty Loan Plan, selling interest-bearing Liberty bonds directly to the public.
And this wasn't just about financing. It was also sort of a political move.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
By the end of the war, 20 million people had bought bonds. It raised $17 billion and tied the public directly to the war's success.
But it's hard for us to wrap our heads around what that meant for the average person. I mean, the sources remind us this was the dollar-a-day era for a lot of factory workers.
Right.
The smallest bond was $50. That's about 2 weeks' salary for many people.
Yeah, that's a huge commitment. And McAdoo understood that gap. He knew he needed to connect every single American to the effort. He called the war a crusade that needed a powerful stream of romanticism.
And that's where the thrift stamp comes in.
That's it, the 25-cent thrift stamp, the ultimate financial democratization, you could say.
So anyone could buy one.
Anyone. You could buy a stamp, collect 16 of them, trade it for a $5 war savings stamp, and eventually work your way up to a bond. It framed this massive, expensive war as a popular patriotic movement that was accessible to absolutely everyone.
Okay, but here's the core contradiction. The same government selling this war as a unified democratic crusade is, at the exact same time, building a legal framework to crush any voice of dissent at home.
It's the dark side of mobilization. On June 15, 1917, the Espionage Act is passed, and it established these severe penalties. We're talking up to the death penalty or 30 years in prison for any actions intended to interfere with military operations.
But its real power wasn't just about catching spies, was it? It was about silencing critics.
That is the key takeaway. The act declared any material that advocated for treason or resistance to U.S. laws as non-mailable.
Non-mailable.
Right, so it gave the Postmaster General this immense, unchecked power to basically censor and block any radical anti-war or even labor publications from being sent through the mail. It strikes directly at their ability to communicate and organize.
Okay, so if that's the atmosphere tightening on the American home front, we have to look across the Atlantic. Because just as the U.S. is gearing up, its main partner on the Eastern Front, Russia, is completely falling apart.
It was a true earthquake. And it's important to remember there were really two revolutions in 1917. The first, the February Revolution, is when peasants and workers revolt against Tsar Nicholas II. They force him to abdicate.
And a provisional republic takes over. Early American media seemed hopeful about that, right? The sources say they covered it with joy.
They did. They saw it as a sister republic joining the fight for democracy.
But that hope didn't last very long.
Not at all. 7 months later, in October, you get the second, much more dramatic Red Revolution. This is what brings Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks to power. Leon Trotsky takes over the Petrograd Soviet, and the socialist seizure of the state is complete.
And the immediate strategic consequence for the war. It must have been devastating for the Allies.
Catastrophic. The Bolsheviks wanted out of the war immediately. By late 1917, Russia establishes an armistice. They're effectively out of World War I.
Which frees up huge numbers of German troops.
Exactly. They can now shift from the Eastern Front to the Western Front, just as these new, but still very green, American forces are starting to arrive. The whole strategic balance of the war just gets turned on its head.
So the pressure on everyone else just ratchets up tenfold. And that brings us back to the U.S. home front, where this global pressure and all this talk about fighting for democracy collides violently with people demanding their own rights.
And you see this most clearly in the federal government's targeting of organized labor. The crackdown on the industrial workers of the world, the IWW, was maybe the clearest example of the Espionage Act in action.
The raids.
The raids. September 5th, 1917, federal agents launch 48 coordinated raids across the country. They seize records, arrest hundreds of activists, including their leader, Big Bill Haywood, the charge, obstructing the war effort.
But the sources show it wasn't just about anti-war sentiment. They were targeting a specific kind of organizing.
Precisely. Among the people arrested was a leader named Ben Fletcher. He led IWW Local 8, which was noted as the longest-lasting interracial union of the entire World War I era.
So by targeting the IWW, the government was suppressing groups that bridged racial and class divides.
All under the cover of wartime security. And this official repression was happening right alongside this brutal extrajudicial violence like the Bisbee deportation, where about 1,000 striking mine workers were just rounded up and abandoned in the desert.
That same volatile mixed wartime economics and racial tension also fueled just catastrophic violence during the Great Migration.
Absolutely. The massive demand for labor in factories drew thousands of African Americans north. Somewhere between 10 and 12,000 moved to East St. Louis, Illinois.
And that competition for jobs and housing just exploded.
It exploded in July 1917 into the East St. Louis riot. The sources from the time call it the worst racial rioting the country had ever seen. The descriptions are just stomach-churning.
Hundreds of African Americans killed. There were reports of children being thrown into burning houses, families boarded up inside their homes and torched.
It's just horrific, and the hypocrisy was so stark. Black Americans are being told to go fight for democracy overseas while they're facing mass murder at home.
Which led to a really powerful response, the Silent Parade.
The Silent Parade, organized by James Weldon Johnson. On June 19th, 10,000 African Americans marched silently down Fifth Avenue in New York City, protesting the systemic violence.
And this tragedy also launched a major new figure onto the national stage.
It did. A man named Marcus Garvey. His furious public condemnation of the massacre in Harlem on July 8th, it just propelled him into the national spotlight. It shifted his focus permanently to challenging American race relations.
Finally, we have to turn to the fierce showdown over suffrage. Women activists campaigning for the right to vote adopted these militant tactics, essentially turning the White House itself into a battlefield for democracy.
The National Woman's Party, led by Alice Paul, started picketing the White House on January 10th. The first group ever to do that. They call themselves the Silent Sentinels.
And they held these provocative banners, right? Comparing President Wilson to Kaiser Wilson.
They did, intentionally highlighting the hypocrisy of fighting a war for democracy abroad when millions of American women couldn't even vote. The government responded by arresting them, treating them like common criminals.
Which led to the infamous Night of Terror. The sources on this are just brutal. How did that abuse end up shifting public opinion so dramatically?
It was the documentation of the physical torture. That was the key. On November 14, 1917, at the Occoquan workhouse, the guards were just let loose on the suffragists. We know Lucy Burns was beaten, her hands chained above her head all night.
Unbelievable.
Another woman, Dora Lewis, was knocked unconscious when her head was smashed against an iron bed. And when Alice Paul and others went on hunger strikes to protest, prison doctors subjected them to this incredibly painful force feeding.
Shoving tubes down their throats.
Yes, to pour in raw eggs and milk.
Yeah.
And the documentation of that violence, the fact that American citizens demanding the vote were being tortured, it was a tactical victory for them.
A public relations disaster for the administration.
A total disaster. The public outrage was immense. And the result? Wilson, who had resisted for so long, finally announced his support for the suffrage amendment in early 1918, just weeks after those women were released.
We've spent so much time on policy and protest, but let's just pause for a second. How was all this information, the war news, the bond drives, the riots, how was it actually being consumed in 1917? What did the media landscape even look like?
It's a completely different world. Newspapers were physically dense. We're talking extremely small font, like size 10, single space, just a wall of text with very few tiny photos.
That sounds exhausting to read, and editing must have been a nightmare.
It was. They used this thing called the linotype process, where a machine casts entire lines of metal type. So if you had a typo, like that Sweeping Gains headline with two N's we saw in the sources, correcting it was so difficult and expensive that they often just left it in.
And those Sweeping Gains headlines, they weren't always real victories, were they?
No, not at all. The sources show that was often intentional propaganda. When the German army made a planned strategic withdrawal to a stronger defensive line, the Hindenburg Line Allied papers would frame it as a massive victory, a sweeping gain.
To boost morale.
To boost morale and keep people buying those Liberty bonds during the grim reality of trench warfare.
Amidst all this chaos, though, the daily paper still had these little humanizing details. What else was happening on the ground?
Well, the famous dancer, Mata Hari, was arrested in Paris, suspected of being a German spy. In sports, a young pitcher for the Boston Red Sox named Babe Ruth beat the Yankees with a 3-hit win. And Johanna Westerdag became the very first female professor in the Netherlands.
And I love those little ads, like the ones for ladies' kimonos for 65 cents. When you put that back in the context of the dollar-a-day worker, you realize just how tight everything was.
It ties it all together, doesn't it? The same person struggling to afford that 65-cent kimono is being asked to give up 2 weeks' pay for a $50 bond, or at least save up all their 25-cent thrift stamps, all while their labor union might be getting raided.
So as we wrap this up, 1917 really is defined by this jarring contradiction. The U.S. commits to making the world safe for democracy.
But that very commitment provides the legal and political cover to simultaneously crush the democratic rights of its own citizens, its workers, racial minorities, and women right here at home.
If we connect that to the bigger picture, the sources really prove that these severe security measures, the Espionage Act, the raids, the brutal handling of the suffragists, they were all justified as necessary for the war.
Right. The external conflict allowed the state to drastically narrow the boundaries of what was acceptable political dissent. It fundamentally changed the relationship between the government and citizens who dared to organize.
So what does all this mean for the future of political dissent in America? That power given to the Postmaster General to just declare things non-mailable. It was an attack on the flow of information itself.
It cripples the ability of radical groups to communicate. But what's really fascinating here, I think, is that the legal architecture of the global war tools like the Espionage Act that were designed to protect the nation from external enemies ended up having their most immediate and powerful effect on internal American social movement, on citizens demanding their rights. This period of repression set this chilling precedent for government control that affected labor and the Black freedom struggle for decades. Just think about the lasting implications of testing war legislation against your own citizens first.